I would like to invite and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand. I have to apologize for the delay. We had technical problems. We're about an hour late, and I must commend those who have been patient enough. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand. I have to apologize for the delay. We had technical problems. We're about an hour late, and I must commend those who have been patient enough. I don't know. We don't seem to have the technical problems solved. We're still getting that echo with a 10-second delay, but it comes. Everything I say ends up being repeated again and again and again, a continuous loop. I don't know. We don't seem to have the technical problem solved. We're still getting that echo with a 10-second delay, but it comes. Everything I say ends up being repeated again.
Cliff, close every single program you have open on your computer. Everything. Just leave open only Zoom and nothing else.
I think I might have found where the echo was coming from. I've closed something that I hope will eliminate it. So let me proceed and hope that I won't be repeating myself. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we've offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors, programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and much more. Send your suggestions to us for future webinars, if you would. On this webinar, we will be taking questions and would like to, during the question and answer period, would like to be able to entertain your questions. We found the best way to do that is for you to email your questions rather than using the chat box on YouTube. You see on your screen the email address to send your questions or comments to after each presenter has spoken, and they will be presented to them during our question and answer period. We're fortunate to be able to bring to you today, three outstanding speakers. They've been in the forefront of reimagining socialism, as well as practical efforts to build it. Michael Lebowitz is a Marxist economist who taught for many years at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. He was also an advisor in Venezuela during the Chavez government, helping to implement the Bolivarian Revolution. Here is one of his books based upon that experience, the Socialist Alternative, Real Human Development. This is an insightful envisioning of socialism. In January, he'll be coming out with a new book titled Between Capitalism and Community from Monthly Review Press. Our second speaker will be Dario Azzellini. He comes from the autonomist school of thought. He's authored Communes and Workers Control in Venezuela, Building 21st Century Socialism from Below, as well as many other books. And he too has a new book coming out in January titled, If Not Us, Who? Workers Against Authoritarianism, Fascism, and Dictatorship. Dario has also authored a chapter in our book, Moving Beyond Capitalism, that explains the communal councils and communal state that the Bolivarian Revolution was building. Our third speaker will be Camila Pineiro Harnecker from Cuba. She also has a chapter in Moving Beyond Capitalism about Cuba's cooperatives and their role in its socialism, which will be the topic of her presentation today. Camila is a social scientist at the University of Havana's Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy. She's a prominent advocate of cooperatives in socialist construction. In 2013, she put that topic into public discussion in Cuba with the publication of this book, Cooperatives and Socialism, A View from Cuba. Well, I want to welcome you all warmly for this discussion and invite Michael to present his presentation as the first one, followed by Dario and then Camila. If you'll unmute yourself, Michael. You're still muted. There. Okay. Go for it.
I hope there are no more technical problems on my end, since I had a few myself. Let me just say, because I may cut my presentation a bit short because of the loss of time to give the others more chance. But let me just begin by saying that I have a problem with the title of the discussion of socialism in the 21st century. And I think it's important to make a distinction between that and socialism for the 21st century. I've had discussions, for example, with friends in Cuba who want to talk about socialism in the 21st century. And by that, they're suggesting that there was or is socialism, but it now faces new challenges in the 21st century to which it must adjust and respond to. And I think that that is a problem because it fails to recognize the distinctive character of socialism for the 21st century. In particular, I think one thing immediately distinguishes socialism for the 21st century and previous conceptions and practices of countries which have experimented with socialism, and that is the concept of protagonism. When socialism for the 21st century suggests a society and a practice in which people are constantly transforming themselves in the very process of transforming society. So it implies that human beings in workplaces, in communities, in society in general, are constantly in this process of transformation. This concept comes back to Marx's concept of revolutionary practice, in which Marx defined revolutionary practice as the simultaneous changing of circumstances and human activity, or changing of self. And that was a red thread that ran through Marx all the time. He constantly talks about how people workers in the process of struggle are transforming themselves, making themselves fit to build a new society, that there is a process of transforming circumstances and men. He uses the term there. So I think that that's important to begin by understanding. It's a concept that actually Marx drew upon Hegel for. In fact, in the 1844 manuscripts, he talks about Hegel's insight, Hegel's genius in recognizing that human beings, real man, he says, is the outcome of man's own activity. And that's certainly the concept of, in the phenomenology of mind in Hegel, is the concept of the slave through his activity, or the serf through his activity, informing things, advances in development. So you have this emphasis on human activity and human development. And that's not something that we can see as characteristic of real socialism, or what was called actually existing socialism, because socialism for the 21st century implies activity and initiative from below. But socialism, real socialism, or actually existing socialism, what was characteristic was direction from the top. And I described that in my book on Contradictions of Real Socialism as a society of conductor and conducted, in which the conductor sees himself as alone having the whole picture, and is very conscious of the problems of spontaneity. The conductor basically says that without me, without my insight, all would be chaos. And that's a position that was described by Paulo Freire, in which he, of the whole perspective in which people may, in fact, desire to change the society, may desire to get rid of an unjust society, but they think that they are the only ones who can do this. They think that they in fact do not trust the people. And that is, an aspect of socialism for the 21st century, which is the emphasis on trusting people, It's the concept of Rosa Luxemburg saying the working class demands the right to make its own mistakes and to learn in the dialectic of history. So that's one of the things that we have to see is quite different in 21st century socialism. And that was certainly something that we could see in Venezuela right from the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution. If you go to the Bolivarian Constitution, you see this emphasis there, in which they talk about the emphasis on ensuring overall human development, that everyone has the right to free development of his or her own personality, and the process by which that happens, it explicitly indicated in the Bolivarian Constitution that participation, protagonism by people is, quote, the necessary way of achieving the involvement to ensure their complete development, both individual and collective. So you have that, emphasis on protagonism, and that's something that you could, see in President Chavez's own development, which, he began, explicitly, talking about a third way, effectively a good capitalism, a capitalism that, dealt with some of the problems and, generated by capitalism, but it was effectively a perspective, at least announced as one of, good capitalism. That, however, came to a significant halt after the coup and after the lockout of PDVSA and many of the capitalist firms, which occurred in 2002 and 2003. And what you see then is Chavez, developed a focus on, explicitly talking about socialism. He had said at the closing meeting of the 2005 World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, said, we have to reinvent socialism. It can't be the kind of socialism that we saw in the Soviet Union, but it will emerge as we develop new systems that are built on cooperation, not competition. And we cannot resort to state capitalism, would be the same perversion of the Soviet Union. We must reclaim socialism as a thesis, a project, and a path, but a new type of socialism, a humanist one, which puts humans and not machines or the state ahead of everything. And certainly this was something that, although it's not until actually the end of 2004 that he begins to talk explicitly about socialism, but he in fact had been talking about it all along in discussing what he called the social economy. And he had contrasted the social economy with the capitalist economy. He said in 2003, the logic of capital is a perverse logic. It doesn't care about destroying rivers and Lake Maracaibo. He went on and contrasted that to the social economy, saying the social economy, the logic of the social economy is based on the human being, on work, that is to say on the worker and the worker's family, that is to say in the human being. Its purpose is the construction of the new man, the new woman, the new society. And certainly there was a real advance in consciousness in Venezuela after the lockout, both the coup, which was quickly reversed, and the lockout, which went on several months. And one of the characteristics of the lockout was people responded and kept, for example, PDVSA functioning, opened up the stores, acted collectively in one way or another to, in fact, defeat the lockout. And I had discussions with workers at PDVSA in 2004 who had this enormous pride and dignity, and sense of dignity at what they had accomplished in keeping the PDVSA, the oil company, going. And certainly that was characteristic of much of the focus at the Solidarity meetings in 2005. At the workers' panel, one worker after another, representatives of different enterprises, got up and talked about how they were moving in the direction of worker management, of what they called co-management, which was not like the German concept of co-management, but rather a concept which is basically co-optation, but rather a partnership between the state and the workers. And that was the concept of co-management. And there was a massive May Day march in 2005 with the theme, without co-management, you cannot have socialism. And that was a quote from Chavez. Now, Chavez was very clearly focused on co-management, on worker management, something he came back to, on a number of occasions. But as maybe Dario will talk about, that impulse was defeated time and time again by those who were, in the government with him, by those who were ministers, by those who were the executives of the state companies, and furthermore by economistic trade unions. So that was a focus there. 2005, the Solidarity meetings, there was also a session, a major session in one of the cities on the whole question of participation. The conference itself, the Solidarity meetings, were organized by Martha Harnecker, Camila's mother, but she herself took the initiative to run the panels on participation. And at those, and she had set aside all the examples of participation that seemed to be happening in the country, but it left room to find out cases where they didn't know where participation and protagonism was happening that people didn't know about. After the meeting, she was very, surprised that nobody had, in fact, that they didn't know about came up, but somebody had handed her a folder. So she read it after the meetings, and it was from a group of workers from the city of Cumana in the state of Sucre. And they had been working had developed the concept of the communal council, which was spelled out, and they had been working on it for 5 years. Now, this was a group of people from the Socialist League, Liga Socialista, who had decided that they were trying to organize the wrong working class, and that the way to really organize the working class was in the communities, where they were. So anyway, it was a very impressive thing that had been tested for a number of years. And Marta then took this and convinced Chavez to, in fact, build the concept of a program of communal councils based on that. And that was the concept of the law on communal councils in 2006. And the basic structure was communal councils based on 200 to 400 families in the urban areas, 20 to 50 in the rural areas. The major decisions were made at on the General Assembly, so it was a form of direct democracy. And then people who were elected on particular activities were there as voceros, spokespeople, rather than functioning as the delegates who you never hear about until the next election. So that was a concept there, and there were limits to what the communal council could do because of their size. So the next step that was seen was to bring communal councils together, for them to organize together to create the commune. And the commune then became a major focus of activity. It continues to be. And the logic was you would move from the communal council to the commune to the communal city up to the communal state. This was a whole concept of building from below. When Chavez spoke of the communal councils, and presumably also the workers' councils, as the cells of the new socialist state. But as I mentioned, there was certainly resistance to the communes, as well as to workers' management, and that was there was a process of continuing struggle there. And one of the things that we can see is that Chavez was unhappy about the slow progress of the communes. So in the last meeting that he had with his cabinet in 2013, Chavez said, where are the communes? Why aren't they there? Why isn't everybody, focusing on building the communes? Maybe we should have every minister should be a minister of communes rather than just having a separate minister. And he criticized them for not reading things that he had asked them to read. He had circulated to them readings by Mao on the communes in China. And he said, at this point in this last speech, which has been called a golpe de timon, the strike at the helms, change direction. He said, we have to change direction. We have to, build, because the communes are everything. And his argument was that that explicitly was, it's time to act, time to build the commune, the soul of the entire project. And he warned his ministers that if we fail to change direction, we would not only be liquidated, we would be the liquidators ourselves. And his then statement, very famous statement, which continues as a theme for for the communards now, is "Comuna o nada," communes or nothing. And that's, I think I'll stop on the description of that because I'm sure, that's something that both Dario and Camila can talk about. But I want to just stress one thing and just a general argument, which is, one of the things from this you could see is that socialism for the 21st century is not a stage. It's not a fixed, institution with particular characteristics. Rather, it's a process. It's a process of building a new society a society based on community, and it does it through protagonism. Would just simply note that in Cuba, Marta and I and several others created a program called Socialism for the 21st Century. We had several public meetings, and we published 5 short booklets on the theme of socialism for the 21st century. That unfortunately, because of Marta's death and because of some of the problems with the institution that she had created called MEPLA, that project has stalled. But Camila is in the process of, trying to resurrect it and to have, in place of MEPLA, which no longer exists, a new institution called Foundation Marta Harnecker. And I should just simply add to that in the lines of this concept of socialism for the 21st century, the major lines of inquiry are socialism and human development, cooperatives and self-management, and decentralized participatory planning. And I think that points to the unique characteristics of socialism for the 21st century, in contrast to what the 20th century experienced. So I'll just stop there, and as an introduction for Dario and Camila.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't see Dario. He's having electricity problems, so maybe I should go ahead. We were planning him to go second, but so I'm going to continue.
Okay.
Good afternoon again. I'm gonna be sharing my screen, but I can't do it because I'm not the host. So Cliff, you can make me the host, or you can use the slides you have. And I'll just start. And while Cliff has it figured out, you can let me know, Cliff, if I'm able to share. Now I'm the host. Okay, good. So here you can see, and Dario. So the idea was, Dario, are you here?
Yes.
Yeah, so you go first and then I'll go
first. Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna unshare.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try my best, but I'm unfortunately in this failed country, which has no real infrastructure, no.
Dario is frozen.
Yes. He was telling us about the inadequate infrastructure and then proceeds to demonstrate it, unfortunately.
Okay, so.
So Camila,
okay.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So you can see, right, the role of cooperatives in socialism, right?
Right.
Okay. So yeah. So Mike, and thank you. One of the lines or the points that the program for the socialism of the 21st century, for the 21st century, is also had set up to work on is cooperatives and self-managed enterprises. And so this is a connection for those of us who believe in socialism as an alternative to capitalism, and socialism as what we argue Marx really saw it. We see cooperative and self-management as a key component of that socialism, right? So participation and protagonism in the workplaces. And so that's what I'm planning to cover. First, cooperatives, for those of you who don't know, have like a dual character. They are associations of people who come together because they have a common problem to try to address it through an enterprise. So the enterprise is the tool that the group of people use to solve a specific problem and to satisfy a need, which doesn't have to be only economical, as we'll see. And so above all, cooperatives are democratically managed by its members, and therefore they respond to the common group interest of each member, no? And they cannot be directly controlled by the state. This was a characteristic that was rightly understood by people like Che, who criticized cooperatives because they could become group capitalists, right? We have better or more hopeful expectations from cooperatives, and I can argue why we do so. So just so you know, because I'm going to be talking about different kinds of cooperatives, worker cooperatives are those who are composed by the workers, and that doesn't mean just like the workers, that it can include management too, if they are seen as workers, right? All kinds of workers. So consumer by consumers, it can be either client of users, and producer co-ops, which are basically independent producers, farmers, businesses, etc., right? And there is this other kind of or type of cooperative that is not very well understood. It's more like a maybe 2 decades phenomenon, 3 decades at the most, which are called multi-stakeholder cooperatives. And what makes them interesting is they can have a very complex and flexible governance structure that allows for not just have workers, consumers, or producers, but a mix of at least 2 of them. And many times a representative of community interests. This can be community organizations, local governments, all kinds of community organizations, right? And what is key for us who are trying to think about socialism is that they can respond to broader social interests, and not just because of social responsibility, etc., but because in their governance structure, they are representative of these broader social interests. And so socialism, I don't have to tell you much after what Mike said, but it's basically, however we want to call it, is an attempt to overcome capitalism, the exploitation of women and men and nature, and the exclusion that it brings and that it requires. Some people have and some people don't have, right? The 1 and the 99%. And the goal is full overall development of human beings. And the main means to achieve that is democratic social control of the economy and the state, right? It's much more than that. I'm just trying to put it in simple words. And something that is important to keep inside is that you cannot do all this, like doing all this, but without a culture that is guided by the values of equality and solidarity, you are not going to get to socialism. And that's why people like Shea were so adamant about the importance of building these new men and women, no? And basically what we're trying to do is to have an hegemony or hegemonic social relations. That means that they predominate. That doesn't mean that they are like 100%, right? But they predominate and they set up the way, the dynamics of the system, right? And these are the association, the free association of labor, right? Workers. And you can see some of these ideas in a few excerpts in Marx and Engels' work, and especially some in the Communist Manifesto, where they talk about this free association of labor, sometimes translated as producers, that are guided or united by a common plan, no? And Lenin, in one of his last writings on cooperation, he talked about very directly the regime of cult or educated cooperative members, that is socialism. So after all this, like the suitability or of cooperative for socialism is not a straight answer, right? Cooperatives can be socialist. We know there are many cooperatives in the world and they don't have much resemblance of what we would expect from a socialist enterprise, right? But they have the potential to do it. To the degree that they're truly democratic, we know that there are many, the same as with many other institutions, that they are supposed to be one thing and they are another, right? But cooperatives are supposed to be democratic, no? If they're truly democratically managed, they have to respect this principle of one person, one vote. And as I said, this democratic participation needs to be guided by the cooperative values, which we could see very similar to what we would expect of socialist values in an enterprise, right? And principles, the cooperative principles, which favor labor over capital, etc. Do not limit the time and resources needed for participation in cooperative education, no? Education is key and is the golden rule for cooperatives to be successful. Do not hire labor permanently. We have many cooperatives that have many more higher wage workers than the cooperative members, and that goes against. That would be excluding and exploiting others, right? So in addition to being truly democratically managed, the cooperatives must be oriented towards broader social interests beyond the group of people who are the members, right? And that means that they should be directly satisfying social needs and aspirations as much as possible. They should not follow the logic of profit maximization, following prey to market relations. They should have fair prices and internalize costs, right? They should also take into consideration how they are impacting in their surroundings communities and how these communities can regulate their behaviors, no? In some cases, it can be necessary if the impact is considerable, right? So there are many ways that can be done. I'm just listing a few there. Adequate incentive system, both material and spiritual or moral. Conditional clauses in contracts. This is something that is used in Cuba with the leasing of state property, state contracts. Democratic planning, that's something that needs to be advanced much more, but there are some experiences where communities and cooperatives have come together to see how they can contribute to local development strategies, and multi-stakeholder cooperative, which I have mentioned before. So in short, cooperative can be suitable for cooperatives to the degree that they contribute to establishing these relations of association and cooperation and to full human development, both within cooperatives and beyond them and their memberships, right? And so there is a big but to whether cooperatives are suitable for socialism, as I mentioned, because they at the end, they are owned and they respond to narrow social interests, right? They can respond to broader, but that's not, they are actually like owned by a group of people, no? And there can be some participation of those representative of broader social community interests, but they're not going to have complete control over them, right? So for those activities that are strategic, and this can in Cuba is said fundamental, it combines some activities that you might consider basic, but the idea is that for this kind of activities where you need to have a national interest taken into consideration at all times, in the long run, at any time, and where you need to have like to follow very precise standards or quality norms, you need to that need to be heavily monitored. It might not be effective to have cooperative. It might be better to have some kind of state enterprises with workers' councils. No, we're not talking about the conventional state authoritarianly managed enterprise, but cooperatives might not be the best approach, right? We have to be honest about it. However, it doesn't mean that it cannot be done. There might be ways of doing it, and the group of people can represent broader interests too, because they feel part of the broader community, right? So multi-stakeholder cooperatives, again, and co-management, no, as has been attempted, although there are some risks with co-management when the state that is not supportive as well. So potentials of cooperatives for building socialism, there are many, and something that we are worried about, which is inequality, and which comes out of like property and wealth concentration. An advantage of cooperatives is that they allow, through intercooperation, achieve a larger production scale without this problem. And they also allow to combine institutional conditions for productivity. So they have incentive for people to produce both positive incentive and negative incentives, because if you don't follow the rule and you are closely supervised by the people around you who are members and who have a stake on the business being successful, you are gonna be taken out of the cooperative if you're not following, if you're not contributing your fair share, right? And those who so the cooperative allows to have the incentive for productivity, and at the same time allow people to satisfy the spiritual needs by the values and capacities that are developed through the managing of the cooperatives and being part of the cooperative. And as part of that, the cooperatives allow members to develop their democratic skills and attitudes. No, these are values, the ability to listen to others, to be part of the democratic process inside the cooperative and in other organizations. And so there are people who study cooperative who talk about humanistic management and how they you can diminish like division of labor between intellectual and manual work, etc. No, that can be achieved in cooperatives. Not in all cooperatives is done, but it can. So as I mentioned, cooperatives can pursue not just economic, but also social, cultural, and environmental goals. Is whatever the members decide they want to do with the cooperative. And in places where the economy is controlled by the state, like in Cuba, or countries that are trying to build socialism, cooperatives can be a useful tool to allow the state to concentrate in such strategic activities without having widespread privatization, right? And as I mentioned, they can be oriented towards social interests, although this is not spontaneously, and can satisfy community needs and the positive spillovers for local development, no, that this cooperative can bring. There are many potentials, but there are also failings and limits. No, that some are intrinsic to the cooperative, but some are due to the the framework in which they operate. So fake cooperatives, we know, and they can be avoided. Not a democratically managed cooperative where there is self-exploitation, hiring of wage labor permanently. These are all problems that cooperative can have, but they can be avoided through cooperative education, intercooperation, democratic planning. So cooperatives can ignore or violate social interests following the market logic. And so we need to promote spaces for coordination with social interests, and also intercooperation allows them to avoid the logic of the market too. A significant number of cooperatives can fail. So cooperatives are enterprises, but because they have this dual character, they need some support, and they need some rules that allows them to thrive. That there are reasons why cooperatives are not more widespread, and it's not because it's a bad model. It's because it needs like a framework that is nurturing for them, and so we need an enabling legal and regulatory frameworks. We need this cooperative support ecosystem. We need access to finance, etc., and we need intercooperation and coordination, to bring cooperatives to scale and to have an impact in a place. And of course, cooperatives by themselves are not socialism. We need the community council. We need the communes. We need the culture. We need much more than them. So this is very simple, just to show that cooperative would be part of an economic system where they are not the only. We're not talking about cooperatives, as I mentioned, managing all businesses. It would be in complementing state enterprises, as I said, focusing on these strategic or fundamental activities, with some role for the private sector, because we cannot like in Cuba, is small, medium, family, more than family many times, but enterprises, we cannot force everyone to join a cooperative. Hopefully we can convince, and the private sector is limited to family, self-employment, and small and medium enterprises with a social orientation, right? But the idea here is that cooperative can contribute differently from the private sector, these public goods and services and cooperative values, that can be bring into the firms, the state firms, and make their functioning more effective. And so just very quickly, like what kinds of roles can cooperatives play in socialism? The traditional cooperatives that we know, worker, producer, consumer, do have a role, I think, especially for non-public goods. These are goods and services that don't have a big impact in people's like basic needs. But we can also see a big role, like in Cuba, worker cooperatives that are leasing state property. And so the state has some control, because it still controls the property, and the cooperative is managing that property. And so it can allow, it can provide support services to the state enterprises and all, right? Multi-stakeholder cooperative promoted by local governments to satisfy these public goods and services needs. And something very important, higher tier cooperatives. These are cooperatives of cooperatives, cooperative unions, central federations, etc., to allow members to enjoy the advantage of intercooperation. We know that isolated cooperatives are not successful, and there is no socialism with isolated cooperatives. They need to intercooperate, and they need to integrate in these cooperative integration or representation bodies, which should play a role in facilitating coordination with the state. And so some final consideration, a cooperative is compatible with socialism to the degree that it's managed democratically and has a social orientation. Contradictions between co-op group interests and broader social interests can be largely reconciled through spaces for democratic coordination, adequate incentive systems, and hegemonic socialist culture. Cooperatives might not be suitable for strategic activities. Cooperatives have an important potential or have important potentials to contribute to local development and to free the state from direct management of non-strategic activities. Cooperatives can serve as schools of democratic practices and values. Cooperative expansion can contribute to social relations, this hegemony that we need in order to have socialism. And cooperative expansion requires enabling and regulatory frameworks and this support ecosystem and the institutional frameworks that facilitate through democratic management and that they internalize social interests. So I think I'm on time. Just a few publications there if you are interested. You don't need to buy that very expensive book that Cliff showed. There is a version in Spanish that you can download for free. You just need to learn Spanish, which would be useful anyway. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Camila. Thank you, Camila, for a very concise and insightful presentation. Dario has not been able to rejoin us, and so I'm afraid that unless he does pop in somehow or another, we'll have to not include him in the discussion, although it's certainly quite relevant to what has been said so far. If you have questions or want to send in a comment for our speakers, this is the email to use, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And if you put question in the subject line, it'll make it easier for me to spot your question among my various email messages. To start the discussion off, let me present a question that came to my mind as Michael was speaking about the conditions of struggle that make it possible for ordinary people to become fit to found society anew. And the communal councils were an important part of the social practice that was intended to provide an institutional basis for that kind of protagonistic participation. I'm just wondering if you have any assessment as to how those communal councils are doing today under the very extreme pressures that have been applied to Venezuela, and are they still functioning? And if so, have they been able to provide for people in neighborhoods a way to deal with the severe shortages that have been imposed upon the country? If you'll unmute yourself, Mike. Okay.
Well, you don't hear much specifically about the communal councils now. What you do hear about is the communes, and the communes, which are combinations of smaller units. And there's no question that the situation in Venezuela at this point is a horror, in terms of so many ways, because of the sanctions, because of problems in their economic focus in general. So at the top, at the level of the state, there are many questions that could be raised, about this by socialists. But at the commune level, both in rural communes and also in the urban communes, you find enormous initiative and activity continuing. The best way to see that is to read Venezuela analysis, because they cover many, in interviews and articles, many examples of commune practices. So, for example, there is the commune which is in 23 de Enero in Caracas, in the area where the Alexis Viva collective was very active. They've created a commune which has, bakeries, which does collective work in health areas, has their own television station, radios, etc. Radio stations. Enormous activity and a very high level of consciousness. A consciousness which is not only in terms of what they themselves feel they're able to do, but also a consciousness of the extent to which the national government is not functioning in their interest. So I would suggest to anyone who has those questions that you go to VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and read some of these series. They have a whole series which is called In the Commune, which is an examination of different communes. So the communes in the rural areas are having, are certainly well advanced, and they've been creating a network of communes across the country from below. Again, that's a very important aspect of it. They're having some significant difficulty because of fuel shortage at this point. So it's very difficult for them to bring their products to the places where people need them. And that's also a characteristic, I think, of the urban communes, El Panam, I think, in Caracas, where they have in fact established links with communes in the rural areas to get their food and process them, etc. So at that level, and I'm sorry Dario isn't here because he could tell us much more about how the communes are functioning, but the communes are the hope. They do see themselves as continuing the project of President Chavez, and contrast that to what is happening elsewhere in the economy. Did I answer your question?
Okay. Well, actually, we have a question that has come in that certainly connects with that and takes the discussion also to Cuba. This is from Bob Stone. It says, Michael's vision implies that delegates from cooperatives constitute communes. What is the relation of co-ops to communes in Cuba? And what is envisioned?
So Mike, do you want to add something?
Well, I'll just simply, add, the point that in Venezuela, it's not the cooperatives that form communes, it is the communal councils that form the communes. So it becomes a larger governing unit from below. But the logic of the commune was that whereas there are very great limits because of their small size for communal councils to engage in any economic activity, in the communes there is a clear focus on economic activity, but it is not, it's the concept of cooperatives, but these are cooperatives, the enterprises and the activities are owned by the whole commune, not by an individual group that might be in fact self-interested.
Mm-hmm. So they are more like community enterprises.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Camila, is there anything comparable to communal councils in Cuba as cells of an alternative state?
I was thinking in Cuba, we have since the early 90s, the Consejos Populares, which were a way of bringing down to the people the municipalities. And so I would say that community councils in Venezuela are what in Cuba would be the popular councils. And then the communes is a way of having that people's power in the at the more maybe something like the municipal level, but in terms of population it may vary. But in Cuba, unfortunately, I would say the local, like the municipal governments, which would be like the communes in Venezuela, don't have an economic dimension. Only until very recently, where because so far, like until a couple of years ago, all the resources that the municipal governments would have would come down from the national budget, no? And only until maybe it's 5 years or more, they can tax all enterprises, private, cooperative, and state. 1% of sales goes to the local, like the municipal government budget. And with that money, now they're able to set up some enterprises, no? So I would say that this local, and there is an attempt now to pass a legislation for the municipalities in Cuba. And as part of this, the constitutional reform, municipalities have been given more autonomy. And as in reaction to the pandemic now, in the serious economic situation in which Cuba is, and I have to say, because there are people from the US, to a big extent because of the US sanctions, and also, of course, because of there is zero tourism, etc. But you should be aware that the Trump administration is trying everything in its power and is blaming Cuba. Like they say that Venezuela is only surviving because of Cuba, so we are so powerful. But so yeah, we're being how you say, regañados heavily. So in response to this very difficult situation we are living in Cuba, luckily, as it happened in the 90s, now like local initiative from the municipalities are giving more space, and hopefully with the legislation that is going to be passed, it's not just like a conjunctural decision, but more like long-term institutionalized.
Now, one of the things that has inspired so many people who are strong advocates of cooperatives around the world was the decision, what was it, about 5 years ago, that Cuba announced that it was opening the way for non-agricultural cooperatives or urban cooperatives. However, it was that initiative was very slow and halting in its implementation, and there was always the promise that, well, next year we'll really dig down and start doing that as soon as we work out the problems. Well, so far it hadn't happened, but just in recent weeks, the economic plan was announced that included now, at last, I think, the opening of more urban cooperatives. What can you tell us about that, Camila?
Those of us who believe cooperatives have a great potential to contribute to socialism and to solving many of the problems that our people have in a way that reconciles these economic and social cultural objectives. We are very and excited to have heard from the president that we are not clear if it's going to be in October. I'm hoping that it's not so soon, but in the near future, finally, we're going to have a general law of cooperatives, because what we had since late 2012 was a legislation that allowed for the creation of these cooperatives outside of agriculture with an experimental character. And so that experiment was evaluated in 2016, 2017, after like 3 years, because the first cooperatives were created in March 2013 of this so-called non-agricultural cooperative. And so after 3-4 years, there was this evaluation, because in 2015, we were hoping, the first time that it was said that Cuba was going to pass a general law of cooperative as a result of this experiment was 2015, then 2016, then 2017. And after this evaluation, we had not heard about it again. And the result of the evaluation was that there were problems with some cooperatives, the main criticism was that they were not effectively controlled by the state. So it wasn't, or that they were not created, and in some cases there were some correction in terms of construction cooperatives contracting with state institutions and charging higher prices. But as you can see, these are not problems specifically of cooperatives, are problems of state institutions, are problems of the design of the experiment, and are problems of state contracting methods and transparency, no? And so I don't think that's the objective of today, but we did a diagnostic of these cooperatives, and we believe, and I think most people in Cuba believe, that they have shown that they can be successful. Of the more than 345 cooperatives 430 something cooperatives that were created, only less than 10 have failed, and it has been mostly not because of economic reasons, but because the way they were created. Some, like 75%, came out of state business units, and so the process they were created, especially in the first round, was not as it should have been. And so a few of these cooperatives that failed were because of internal conflicts that came out of how they were created, no? And so economically, they have shown they can be effective, and in terms of their social dimension, when you talk to, if they are truly democratic, which in some cases we have to acknowledge some were fake cooperative, and this is due to the fact that they had many advantages. Their tax burden was half of that of a private enterprise. They had a preferential access to state contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have an effective supervision, you're going to have people creating fake cooperatives, no? And that happened, of course, as we had alerted. And so the other problem is that they were not linking to local governments and local development strategies, not because they didn't want to. I know many of them wanted to do that, but local governments were not giving them room to participate. And there were attempts to bring cooperatives in this like debate, like exchange of information and how they can work better with each other, etc., and that were stalled. So I don't think we can blame cooperative for not being closer to the communities. And I think many were contributing, and just with what the goods and services that they're providing, they're contributing heavily to solving some problems. They could do much more. Yeah.
One of the things that I think about is Lenin's statement I guess on cooperation, that if everyone was involved in a cooperative, we would be in socialism. That raises the question, though, which in relationship to Cuba, and that is that the progress in moving toward cooperatives in Cuba has been very slow, as Camila's pointed out. And one of the striking things was when the state opened up areas for work outside the state, they created a possibility of people functioning as cuentapropistas, as people functioning on their own. But they made no distinction between, a small group of people who might be working together and, on the other hand, a capitalist firm. So you had an opening in that direction, but nothing really happening in establishing cooperatives as a basis for building, the socialism stronger in Cuba. So that was always very striking. Why were they so slow in approving, cooperatives?
Yeah, and the justification that was given is because it was an experiment and they were testing before generalizing, and so only 498, like around 500 proposals of cooperatives were approved, and of those 500, only 430 something were created. And this is because some of the approvals came out of state business units who wanted to convert to cooperatives, but the workers there changed their mind or something happened. But what is important to know is that if they had allowed for more cooperatives to be created, there were many more could be created, because only a few months when they decided to stop creating more cooperatives, there was a very short window in which cooperatives were allowed to be created, from early 2013 to late 2014, and at the end of 2014 there were 900 proposals that were not considered. So if they would allow more people to create cooperatives, we would have many more cooperatives, no? But I do believe that, I think they shouldn't have taken that long, but I do think that the institutional framework that we have now for cooperatives is not the best, no? Especially if we're hoping to have socialist cooperatives, no? Especially if we are hoping to have cooperatives being truly successful and contributing to communities. And so hopefully when this general law is passed, it first allows the cooperative sector to participate in the discussions and to learn from what is missing now, and also helps to kind of like change the correlation which we now have in Cuba, where the private sector is seen as successful and the state sector is seen as inefficient, and the cooperative sector are like minimal in there.
Meanwhile, over these 7 years of holding back the development of further cooperatives, self-employed private businesses have flourished and have become a major part of the non-state sector of the economy. Are any of those perhaps potential cooperatives? Is there any way in which they could be converted to cooperatives now under a new general law?
Yeah, I do think that there are many young people who created their businesses, and they would, if they had the opportunity, they would do it. They would have done it as a cooperative, because some of these businesses are a couple of friends who come together and they have this social. I think they would give participation to workers. No, they would. I don't think everyone, but there's some of these entrepreneurs would be willing to give the other people who work with them a share and participation in decision making. No, a share in the business, not like a share in that sense, but to allow them to participate in ownership and decision making.
Mm-hmm.
But we would have to ask them We would see. But I think that's something that is gonna be key, because now that the also, in addition to the law for general law for cooperatives, there's going to be a law for enterprises that allows for private enterprises or to be created, and not like what we have now, which is misusing the term of self-employment to allow for private capitalist businesses, right? And so it's gonna be key how these laws are written and how the institutional framework is set up, so that we have a bigger presence of cooperatives instead of private capitalist enterprises in Cuba.
One of the reasons that many have suggested for the slow takeoff of cooperatives was bureaucratic resistance. Just as in Venezuela, the ministers were not necessarily that sympathetic or understanding of the kind of alternative participatory institutions that the Bolivarian Revolution was about. So too, it's been suggested that the state in Cuba has also been dragging its feet because they are not comfortable with institutions that empower ordinary people.
I feel I have been talking a lot, so I'll let Mike talk first about the experience in Venezuela, and maybe I can close with a more positive note, hopefully.
Well, certainly in Venezuela, there was real reluctance by a number of key ministers to the idea of worker management. This was particularly true of the Minister of Oil and Energy, he was the minister over PDVSA, but also upon, on all the distribution of electricity, etc. He was so opposed to bringing in, to the workers' demands, because the workers were demanding this, that he had invited to the National Assembly, I forget his first name, Orlando Borrega, who was an assistant to Che. Borrega came and spoke at the National Assembly and said Che hated cooperatives. He was opposed to cooperatives, etc. And that was seen as closing, much of the potential advance of cooperatives in Venezuela. Of course, what Che was opposed to was cooperatives in Yugoslavia, which were functioning on the market. And he basically said, how can you build solidarity when you have firms who are engaged in competing with each other in Yugoslavia? And I think that's something I wanted to raise too, which is a problem of cooperatives functioning in the market, functioning to increase their income. So their emphasis is on basically maximizing income per worker within a particular enterprise. That then does not build solidarity between enterprises. In fact, it leads to significant inequality, which was occurring in between enterprises in self-managed enterprises. There were state enterprises which in the nominal juridical management was by the workers' councils. But in fact, there was a very well-known statement that it doesn't matter what you do, it's where you do it. So a person could be doing the precise same job in one enterprise and make the same far more than in another enterprise. So how could you say this was distribution in accordance with contribution? What you had then was a situation of great, tensions between enterprises, which were viewed as the either competition or as suppliers, in which you were trying to get the best price. And not only did that affect inequality among workers, it also created a tendency toward inequality and hierarchy within the enterprises themselves, so that the workers' councils were the juridical decision makers, but they're all in it for maximizing income per worker. Who knows best, it was said, to how to maximize our income of all the workers here, but the experts, the managers. And so, in fact, what happened was the tendency was for the managers to make the basic decisions and the workers' councils to rubber stamp them, on most critical questions. And you have then a situation of relative passivity and lack of development of their capacities at the base, in contrast to those at the middle and higher levels of the enterprise. My understanding is a very similar thing happens with Mondragon, in that the workers themselves tend to be passive, in contrast to the middle and higher management within Mondragon itself, who are very, happy with the situation, whereas workers tend to, look at it as a job in many respects. So that is a problem, I think. These questions of functioning within the market is a major issue, and the potential of inequality and the emergence of inequality, I think, may be a concern in Cuba as well. The feeling at those at the top and of ministers, et cetera, that if you have cooperatives, one of the things that's going to happen is workers are going to make more income in a cooperative than the same workers working in the state enterprise. We can't let that happen. So this is, I think, a concern about inequality, not only in relationship to particular cooperatives, but in general, a concern about inequality within regions of the country. We cannot allow inequality to emerge. Well, who's going to prevent it? Cooperatives spontaneously are oriented to self-interest. So that does not deal with the question of inequality. So I'll go back to you now, Camila.
Yeah, so there I should add that, whereas in Mondragon, there has been some self-criticism. I'm sure many of you don't think is enough, but I think that from what I was studying intensely, that experience many years ago, they had acknowledged many of these problems, but there is something that is not very well known, that in Mondragon there is these intercooperation mechanisms, and is what I was referring to in my presentation. And one is this Solidarity Fund, where all cooperatives contribute, and those who are making surpluses contribute. Like, the more you have surpluses, the more you contribute, and those who are having losses receive funding so that they're able to solve the problem, because they understand they work in a market system and they know that the market is volatile, right, and has cycles. And there is also a fund for labor redistribution, which would be very useful for situations like with the pandemic, where you can bring workers from cooperatives in the service sector, for example, restaurants, etc., into other activities that are having more demand now, right? And so there are very positive aspects about Mondragon that can lead to solutions for these inequalities, and how to operate in a market system, with the goal of operating as much as possible under other rules and changing that system, no? But cooperatives themselves cannot do it, of course. And so what I would say in regard to Cuba is that, I think that the concern of inequality, I think that if that's a concern, but that the private sector creates more inequality than cooperatives, right? And we are allowing anyone to create. So I think that there is some, it needs to be considered the fact that if cooperatives are successful, and if cooperatives, like some cooperatives are expected to take over the roles of some state enterprises. So you can see bureaucrats defending their businesses, their resources, right? And I can say that I don't think it's generalized, but in some ministries, they saw cooperatives as the enemy, no? And they took advantage of that opportunity to evaluate, to heavily criticize and unfairly, and to pull back all the opportunities that they were forced to create in order to contract with cooperatives and operate with cooperatives. So I do think that some bureaucrats see cooperatives not because of inequality, unfortunately, but because they see as a threat to their own self-interest, or maybe the interest of their workers, no? But I think that at the same time, the idea is not to promote cooperatives to the expense of state businesses in Cuba. The idea is for cooperatives to help the state business to concentrate on their core activities, because now we have huge state enterprises that are inefficient because they're trying to do too much also. And we have state enterprises in activities that they should not be doing, no? And so cooperative would, as I said in my presentation, would allow the state to concentrate in what it should be doing and should be doing better. And it has shown that it can be done. Cuba has the first vaccine or candidate for vaccine for the coronavirus in Latin America. Cuba has shown that under state management, it can be efficient and effective, no? But the state that cannot be doing everything, no? And so I think that bureaucrats need to understand that and need to see cooperative as a tool to allow for the state enterprises to improve their management too.
We have another question here that has come in. This one from Doug Morris. Camila, Marx talked about the need for freedom and creative leisure so that people would have the time and energy to manage life individually and collectively, and to develop the full range of our intellectual, imaginative, and productive potentials. This implies a shortening of the work week and work day. How might the cooperative project help in working to realize this goal? Camila, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I would say that in a worker cooperative, the workers are the owners, no? They decide how they're going to use some of the surpluses. And like I can say in Cuba, successful cooperatives were setting time and resources aside to go to collectively to a recreation space, to have time for this education, no? Like each member had to go every week to some training on the cooperative values, on their internal rules, on technical issues. So because the workers can make those decisions, and the legal framework should allow for it, and that's one progress that has been done in Cuba, is that finally the principle of cooperative education is being recognized, and cooperatives are suggested to set resources. Well, hopefully I don't know if this is something we're hoping or is already approved, but they should have resources to dedicate to this, right? To education. And also they have these they call social cultural funds, which they can use for helping address some needs specific of the cooperative members, but many times they can be used for recreational activities and also other whatever other needs they decide.
Let me
Okay,
just
now
throw
we're
in.
beginning to get a lot of questions now, so let's try to be brief in our responses. Go
Okay,
ahead,
well,
Michael.
I just want to quickly say that the questioner, the point of the question is that people's development occurs only through a reduction of the workday. In other words, escape from work. Whereas, in the Yugoslav case, for example, the problem, as expressed by various, writers, was that the workers' council members and had the opportunity to study, etc. But at the end of the workday, they were exhausted, so they didn't have any time. So that meant that the gap in knowledge and capacity between those at the top and those at the bottom did not get smaller, got greater. And one of the things in the discussions we had in Venezuela over the shortening of the workday was that rather than shorten the workday so people could go home and have a beer, what was desirable was to introduce instruction directly into the workplace. So people would learn to, various capacities of accounting, finance, management, etc., in order to reduce the gap. So development of capacities is not something that should only be happening outside work. It should be part of the whole process of work, which allows for human development.
Okay, we have another question from Amara Wasu. Greetings, thanks for the presentation. 21st century socialism and concept of protagonism has been important for my understanding of the importance of socialism today. I'm wondering if you could speak more about how 21st century socialism fits into different tendencies among the left, particularly how you see 21st century socialism speak to the need for socialism from below. I've had conversation with comrades from around the globe who have argued that 21st century socialism isn't really different than just socialism in general and is based solely on failures of Stalinism.
Well, I think that the question of socialism from below versus the concept of protagonism. Can I get the question back up there in the shared screen?
Sure.
Okay, well.
There you are.
I think, okay, one of the problems among different tendencies among the left is that they are engaged in competing as to which vanguard will bring about socialism. In other words, it is a conception in which they will play the role of leader, of conductor to the conducted. That's characteristic not simply of what happened in real socialism, which wasn't simply, the result of Stalin, but it's characteristic of a whole conception. In contrast, the focus of socialism for the 21st century has a different conception of a party. It has a conception of a party which is not top down, in which basically the party instructs and the workers listen and the workers follow. It's rather a concept of socialism which is based on what I talk about my most last book on Between Capitalism and Community, is the focus on a concept of revolutionary pedagogy, in which people, there is people, the vanguard, the leaders focus on a horizontal relationship with people in communities, with people in different social groups, etc., to ensure that people develop from below, develop their own capacities. That's a characteristic, I think, of socialism for the 21st century, which was not characteristic of the dominant left tendencies of the 20th century and presently.
Okay, We have a question here about multi-stake cooperatives coming from Roberto. Does the multi-stake cooperative have been characterized in a new legal figure? Could you give us some actual examples of such multi-stake cooperatives? Guess that's for Camila.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Roberto. Yeah, so the first multi-stakeholder cooperative that we know, I'm sure like there might have been others, but you know, like we think that Rochdale was the first modern cooperative when there is a historical evidence that there were worker cooperatives before then. And there is what I know is that the first multi-stakeholder cooperative came out in Mondragon when a consumer cooperative, which is a very big chain store called Eroski. If you go to the Basque Country, you're gonna see it in Spain too, and I think France. So this is or was a consumer cooperative, and the people who work at those stores were employees of the cooperative, where they could be members as consumers because they bought there, but they were not members as workers. And they realized that they had their interests as workers were not being represented. And so it was decided by Eroski that they would give membership to the workers. Not all workers are members still, but their goal is they can only have 20% of their workers hire as wage workers, no? So they gradually have to make members all of their employees. And the idea is that the way it's organized is that the worker members have like a general assembly, and the consumer members have a general assembly, and they can reconcile their interests, because as you can see, of course, consumers would like lower prices, but workers, they want their incomes, right? And so there is a way to take into consideration both sides, right? And in Quebec and Italy, there are these social, in Quebec, they're called Solidarity cooperatives, and in Italy, and now throughout Europe, they're called social cooperatives. In many cases in Europe and in Quebec, Solidarity cooperatives are those that have a representative of communities. So let's say in many cases it's worker cooperatives that are doing something, and they bring in community representative. In Europe, for example, I know is in many cases the local governments are trying to address, with the disappearance of the welfare state, cooperatives, these social cooperatives are filling in that void. No, it doesn't mean that we agree that it has to be like that, but that's what is happening. And so many of these social cooperatives had some participation of local governments and local community organizations representing larger interests than those of the workers who work there. And there are examples in Argentina, for example, and other places where you have producers and consumers. So like bringing together like agricultural producers with consumers who are buying those or consuming those agricultural goods, and they both have participation in decision making. So you can find all kinds of multi-stakeholder cooperative, and there is no clear like legal structure for it. In some countries, is because it's not specified that it cannot happen, is happening, and in some cases, it's explicitly allowed.
Let me open up one other area for discussion. We have a little time left still. One of the ideas of building socialism includes the construction of commons, the creation of commons, of shared resources available to all members of society. Cuba has the health commons, universal free health care for the entire population. Similarly, education is a commons in the case of Cuba. Now, some of those kinds of commons also exist within capitalist societies, like in the US. We have an education commons at the primary and secondary level. But of course, in capitalism, they are always under attack by neoliberal capitalism that seeking to privatize them and make them a profit center. That's certainly happening in primary and secondary education in the US. And that's also happening with one of the commons that we have now come to recognize the value of more than ever, and that is the US postal system. That too is a commons and is under attack as so many others are. But now, that notion that a key to building socialism lies in the creation of such commons, resources that are shared and available to all members of society, is seen by some as the basis for a strategy to move not towards not to socialism, but towards socialism, even in a capitalist society. We have public parks, we have public lands, number of resources that are shared. And so a strategy for socialists in the United States would be to expand those commons. Do you have any reflections on that as a strategy?
Well, I don't know whether I'm to answer that or Camila is, but certainly taking, various areas of activity outside of the market system, which is what you're describing, but not necessarily a commons. That is, extremely important in terms of reducing inequality, etc. But it's very limited. And I would tend to view these not necessarily as steps toward socialism, as opposed to dealing with particular inequalities that exist within capitalism at this time. But central to, from my perspective, central to the question of moving toward socialism is not the delivery of gifts from above, but rather a process in which people themselves are engaged in acting. So the creation, for example, of a neighborhood garden is a collective process in which people are developing solidarity in that process. There's no such comparable situation when we're talking about, particular activities which are delivered by the state and paid for by a process of taxation. People are not central in that. So I would make a distinction between those two things of dealing with some of the inequalities and some of the abuses of a market system and moving toward socialism.
Okay, Camila, did you want to say anything on that?
It's too bad that Dario was not able to join because he has worked on the comments. And what I can say is that, there are some, what I call in my presentation, public goods and services that a community should have a greater control of, right? And that's where I think that multi-stakeholder cooperative can play a role in some cases. I'm not saying all the time, but in some cases, it should be community enterprises or state enterprises with worker councils, right? But yeah, I think that we don't have socialism like there is something to take out of the previous experience of socialism, which is over ownership of the means of production, no? Of the fundamental, and I think for that it would be also the what we need to live, right? We need to commonly own the land, we need to commonly own the air, etc. Everything we need to live. It should not be private property of a few or cooperative of a few if it's not how you say, oriented towards social interests, right? In an institutional way. And so what I can say is that whereas cooperatives are not the best institutional arrangement to manage the commons, they might be useful in some cases, right?
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I want to thank both of our presenters. You know, we are in your debt for the ideas that you have shared so generously with us today. Only sorry that Dario was not able to join us, and hopefully we'll have him back on another occasion, because I know he has a lot to say on these questions as well. And I apologize to the audience for the 1 hour delay in getting this started. I know that some people left rather than waiting for that long, but please pass the word around that this has been recorded and will be available on our website, globaljusticecenter.org, so that you can see it and other programs of the center. You should know that all of our programs have been changed. All of our in-person have been changed due to coronavirus, but nevertheless, we do continue to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, you know, please do so at our website. I want to call your attention to next week's program, which hopefully will go free of technical glitches. We'll be looking at the way in which the pandemic has shown that the private system of funding medical care in the United States is a disaster. This will be a talk by Professor Vicente Navarro of the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. He's written on this topic and is a major advocate of free public health care in the United States. Medicare for all is what it is currently being called by many. So tune in next week, 1 o'clock Central Time. I know there were some people who were confused about what time zone we were in. People in the Pacific time zone tuned in late and missed much of it. And people in the Eastern time zone tuned in early and had an even longer wait. But our events, our webinars are all 1 o'clock Central Time Zone. So thank you, Camila and Michael, for your presentations today, and best of luck in your continuing work.
And stay
Nice
safe.
seeing you. Nice seeing you, Cliff, and you, Camila. Camila and I do are in regular communication.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Take care, everyone. Be safe and keep fighting.